Sarah Mitchell sat in a hospital hallway at 2 in the morning, holding a phone that would not stop ringing, listening to a voice on the other end tell her that her mother had less than 6 months unless she found $200,000 she did not have. She would later say that single phone call was the moment her old life ended, though she had no way of knowing it then. What she also could not have known, sitting in that hallway with her hands shaking, was that the people who would offer to save her mother's life were the same people who would spend the next 2 years trying to take away everything she had ever built, including her son, her home, and very nearly her freedom. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This is the story of a woman, a mother, and a family that smiled while they planned her downfall, and the one piece of paper buried in a stack of documents she trusted enough not to read twice that nearly cost her everything. By the end of this story, you will understand exactly how a desperate daughter trying to save her mother's life became the target of the very people who claimed to love her, why her husband stopped answering her calls during the worst month of her life, and what finally happened the day Sarah Mitchell walked into a courtroom carrying a folder that would change everything. Stay until the end, because the final twist in this story is something almost nobody who has heard it ever saw coming. Sarah Mitchell grew up in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, raised by a single mother named Diane who worked double shifts at a diner for most of Sarah's childhood so that her daughter would never have to ask anyone for anything. Diane used to tell her, again and again, that the Mitchells took care of their own, that they figured things out quietly, without owing favors to people who would one day expect those favors back. Sarah carried that lesson with her into adulthood, becoming a nurse herself, the kind of woman who picked up extra shifts so other people's families could have one more good day with someone they loved. She married young, to a man named Michael Whitfield, the son of a wealthy real estate family on the other side of town, and for years their life together looked, from the outside, like exactly the kind of story people hope for. Michael's parents, Robert and Patricia Whitfield, had built their fortune over 3 decades buying and reselling commercial property across central Ohio, and they were, by every outward appearance, generous people. They paid for the wedding without being asked. They bought Sarah and Michael's first house outright as a gift and never once brought it up again. Sarah told friends for years that she had married into the kind of family who simply wanted to help, no strings attached, and for a long time that appeared to be true. What she did not fully understand, not yet, was that in the Whitfield family, gifts were rarely free, and the people who accepted them were expected to remember exactly who had given what, and to whom they now belonged. The trouble began the winter Diane Mitchell was diagnosed with an aggressive form of pancreatic cancer, the kind of diagnosis doctors deliver gently, because they know there is very little gentle left to say after it. Her oncologist told Sarah there was a treatment, newer and far more effective than standard chemotherapy, but insurance considered it experimental and refused to cover a single dollar of it. The number Sarah was given, the full cost of the treatment that gave her mother a real chance, was just under $200,000, an amount she could not raise in months, let alone in the handful of weeks her mother's doctors said she actually had. Sarah did everything a desperate daughter does first. She emptied her own savings. She picked up every overtime shift the hospital would give her. She sold her car and took the bus to work for 3 months. None of it came close to enough, and every week that passed without the money meant a week closer to losing her mother for good. It was Michael who finally suggested, almost casually one evening, that they ask his parents. Sarah resisted at first, remembering everything her own mother had taught her about not owing people, but watching Diane grow weaker by the day eventually wore that resistance down to nothing. She told herself it was just a conversation. She had no idea it was the beginning of the worst 2 years of her life. Sarah and Michael drove out to the Whitfield estate on a Sunday evening in late November, the kind of night where the cold settles into your bones before you even get out of the car. Patricia Whitfield met them at the door with a glass of wine already in her hand and told Sarah, before they had even taken their coats off, that family did not let family suffer, that whatever Diane needed, they would simply make it happen. Robert Whitfield sat at the head of a dining table that probably cost more than Sarah's first car and told her, with what sounded like real warmth in his voice, that he would have his attorney draw something up in the morning, just so everyone was protected, just a formality between family. Sarah remembers crying at that table, thanking them over and over, certain in that moment that she had married into the kind of people who simply showed up when it mattered. What Sarah did not know, sitting at that table with relief washing over her for the first time in weeks, was that Robert Whitfield had never once in 30 years of business handed over a six-figure sum without a document that protected his own interests first. The paperwork arrived 4 days later, nearly 40 pages long, delivered by courier to the Whitfield estate with a note asking Sarah and Michael to sign and return it the same week. Sarah skimmed it once, saw the number $200,000 typed clearly at the top, saw her own name and Michael's listed as borrowers, and signed where the yellow tabs told her to sign. She did not read every page. She would later say that decision haunted her more than almost anything else that happened afterward. Buried on page 23 of that contract, in language written by an attorney who had drafted hundreds of documents exactly like it, was a clause that allowed the Whitfield family to recall the entire loan immediately, in full, the moment Sarah was found to have, in the words of the contract, acted against the interests of the family. Attached to that clause was a lien against the small house Sarah and Michael owned together, and a provision tying repayment to Michael's portion of his family's trust, which meant that if the loan was ever called, Sarah stood to lose not just money she did not have, but the roof over her son's head and her husband's inheritance along with it. At the time, none of it seemed alarming. It read like the kind of dense legal language nobody actually expects to matter. It would, in less than 2 years, become the loaded gun pointed directly at Sarah's entire life. The money arrived in Diane's hospital account within the week, and for the first time in months, Sarah allowed herself to feel something close to hope. Diane began the experimental treatment her oncologist had fought so hard to get approved, and within 6 weeks her scans showed real improvement, the kind doctors described carefully but that families hear as a miracle. Sarah threw herself into gratitude. She brought Patricia flowers. She called Robert to thank him personally more than once. She told her own mother, sitting beside her hospital bed, that the Whitfields had saved her life, and for a brief, golden stretch of months, it genuinely seemed that simple. It was during one of those visits, in the spring, that Patricia Whitfield said something to Sarah that she brushed off at the time as nothing more than family advice. Patricia mentioned, almost in passing while pouring tea in her kitchen, that now that the family had stepped in to help with Diane, it might be time for Sarah to step back from her nursing job and focus more fully on the family, on Michael, on their son. Sarah laughed it off, said she loved her work too much to give it up, and changed the subject. She did not yet understand that in the Whitfield family, gratitude was never meant to be temporary, and that Patricia's comment had not been advice at all. It had been the first installment of a debt the Whitfields fully intended to collect, and it had nothing to do with money. By early summer, the small comments had become a pattern Sarah could no longer ignore. Patricia began calling the house during Sarah's shifts to ask, in detail, how the household budget was being managed. Robert mentioned, during a family dinner, that he had spoken with Sarah's hospital supervisor socially and learned she had been picking up significantly fewer overtime shifts since the loan went through, as though her own schedule were now a matter requiring his approval. Michael, caught between his wife and his parents, began siding more often with his mother in small disagreements, telling Sarah she was being sensitive, that the Whitfields had earned the right to be involved after everything they had done for Diane. Sarah started keeping a quiet, private list of these moments in a notebook she hid in her nightstand, though she could not yet have said exactly what she was building a case for. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in August, when Sarah's hospital supervisor pulled her aside and asked, with obvious discomfort, why a member of the Whitfield family had called the Human Resources Department earlier that week asking detailed questions about Sarah's attendance record and her standing with the hospital. Sarah left work that day and drove straight to the Whitfield estate, where she found Patricia in the garden and asked her directly whether she had made that call. Patricia did not deny it. She told Sarah, calmly, that the family simply wanted to understand the full picture, given everything they had invested in her. It was the first time Sarah used the word no out loud to either of them, telling Patricia she wanted to renegotiate the loan on her own terms and pay it back independently, without further involvement from the family. She drove home that evening feeling, for the first time in months, like she had taken a piece of her life back. She had no idea that single conversation was the moment the Whitfields decided to use the contract exactly the way it had been written to be used. 3 weeks after Sarah told Patricia Whitfield she wanted to renegotiate the loan on her own terms, a courier arrived at the small house Sarah shared with Michael and their 6-year-old son, carrying an envelope with the seal of the Whitfield family attorney printed across the front. Sarah remembers standing in her own kitchen, still in her scrubs from a 12-hour shift, opening that envelope with hands that would not stay steady. Inside was a formal notice stating that the Whitfield family was invoking the conduct clause buried on page 23 of the contract she had signed nearly 2 years earlier, claiming Sarah had acted against the interests of the family by attempting to interfere with the terms of the loan. The full $200,000 was being recalled immediately, in full, with a lien already filed against her house. Sarah called Michael at work, certain there had been some kind of mistake, certain his parents would explain this away as soon as she heard their voices. Instead, Michael came home that night quiet in a way she had never seen before, and told her that his parents had already spoken to him, that they believed Sarah had been undermining the family for months, and that he did not know what to think anymore. Sarah asked him directly whether he believed she had done anything wrong. He did not answer her. He simply said it was complicated, and went upstairs to put their son to bed without saying another word to her that night, leaving Sarah standing alone in the kitchen with the notice still in her hand. Within a month, a local paper ran a small story under the headline "Local Family Dispute Turns Bitter Amid Six-Figure Loan," quoting an unnamed source close to the Whitfield family describing Sarah as financially unstable and difficult to work with. Sarah did not know who had spoken to the reporter, though she had a guess. Neighbors who once waved to her in the driveway started avoiding eye contact at the grocery store. A woman from her church asked her, with a concern that did not feel entirely genuine, whether it was true that Sarah had been mismanaging money meant for her own mother's care. Sarah denied it, but she could see in the woman's face that the denial had not fully landed, and she went home that night and cried in her car for nearly an hour before she could bring herself to walk inside. 2 weeks after the newspaper story ran, Michael filed for divorce. Sarah was served the papers at the hospital, in front of 2 co-workers, by a process server who had been waiting in the parking lot for her shift to end. Buried inside the divorce filing, in language Sarah recognized immediately from the loan contract itself, was a request for full custody of their son, citing concerns about Sarah's financial stability and what the filing called a documented pattern of conduct against the family's interests. Sarah sat in her car that night reading the same phrase, acted against the interests of the family, for the second time in 2 months, and finally understood that the contract had never simply been about the money her mother needed. It had been written, from the very beginning, to give the Whitfield family exactly this kind of leverage the moment Sarah stopped being grateful enough to do whatever they expected of her. By the time the foreclosure notice arrived on the house, Sarah had already lost access to the joint accounts Michael controlled, had moved most of her clothes into a single room at a co-worker's apartment, and was seeing her son only on the weekends Michael's lawyer allowed. She remembers standing in the doorway of the house she and Michael had bought together, Watching movers carry out furniture under a court order she had not had the money to fight properly, and thinking of her own mother's voice from decades earlier, telling her that the Mitchells figured things out quietly, that they never owed anyone anything they could not pay back on their own terms. Sarah had broken that rule once, out of love and desperation, and it was about to cost her almost everything she had. Sarah spent the better part of a month calling every family law attorney within driving distance, and most of them, after hearing the name Whitfield and learning the size of the legal team on the other side, found a polite reason to decline. One attorney told her bluntly over the phone that taking on the Whitfield family's lawyers would cost more than Sarah could realistically pay, win or lose. Another suggested she simply settle, sign whatever was put in front of her, and try to rebuild quietly once it was over. Sarah remembers sitting in her car outside that second office, gripping the steering wheel, telling herself that quietly rebuilding was exactly what the Whitfields were counting on her to do. The rumors at the hospital grew worse before they grew better. A coworker mentioned, carefully, that someone in administration had asked questions about whether Sarah had ever mishandled funds related to patient care, a suggestion with no basis in anything Sarah had actually done, but one that nonetheless reached her supervisor's desk and required a formal meeting to address. Sarah sat across from that supervisor explaining, for the second time in her career, that she had never taken a dollar that was not hers, and watched the supervisor nod with the kind of caution reserved for someone whose reputation had already been quietly damaged by people more powerful than she was. Sarah left that meeting understanding, in a way she had not fully grasped before, exactly how much damage a family like the Whitfields could do without ever raising their voices. It was a fellow nurse named Renee Carpenter who finally gave Sarah somewhere to turn. Renee had gone through her own difficult divorce 2 years earlier and had used a local advocate, a woman named Carol Jennings who worked with a small nonprofit helping people navigate financial abuse within families, often for little or no cost. Sarah called Carol on a Thursday evening, expecting another polite decline, and instead spent nearly 2 hours on the phone walking through every page of the original loan contract while Carol asked careful, specific questions about dates and signatures. Carol told her, before they hung up that night, that something about the conduct clause read differently than anything she had seen in a typical family loan agreement, and that she wanted to compare it directly against the copy Sarah had originally signed. Over the following weeks, Carol and Sarah sat together at Carol's kitchen table going through every page of the contract Sarah had been served with during the loan recall, comparing it line by line against the copy Sarah had kept folded in a drawer since the night she signed it. Most of the document matched exactly, until they reached page 23. The conduct clause in Sarah's original copy was worded differently, softer, narrower in scope than the version that had been used to justify recalling the loan and filing for custody of her son. Carol read both versions out loud twice, then looked up at Sarah and told her, in a voice that had gone suddenly serious, that the signature at the bottom of the version used against her did not look quite right. Carol brought in a forensic document examiner she had worked with before, a retired detective who had spent years analyzing signatures and contracts for exactly this kind of dispute. He spent 3 days comparing Sarah's signature across dozens of documents, bank records, hospital paperwork, her son's school forms, against the signature on the version of the contract used to recall the loan. He called Carol on a Friday afternoon and told her, without much hesitation, that in his professional opinion the signature on that page was not a match. Sarah was sitting at Carol's kitchen table when the call came through, and she remembers Carol setting the phone down slowly and telling her, quietly, that the signature on the page that had destroyed her life was not actually hers. Carol Jennings did not waste time once the forensic examiner confirmed the signature was not a match. She filed a formal complaint with the county recorder's office and requested every version of the loan document that had been notarized or filed in connection with Sarah's case, along with the notary records attached to each filing. What came back surprised even Carol. There were two separate notarizations on file, dated only 6 weeks apart, both claiming to witness Sarah's signature on the same loan agreement. The first matched the copy Sarah had kept in her own drawer for 2 years. The second, filed quietly with the county roughly 6 weeks after the original, contained the altered conduct clause and the signature the examiner had already flagged as inconsistent with every other document Sarah had ever signed in her life. The notary listed on that second filing turned out to be a longtime associate of Robert Whitfield's estate attorney, a man named Gerald Pruitt, who had handled Whitfield family business for nearly 20 years. Carol tracked down banking records showing a payment from a Whitfield family account to Pruitt's office dated just 4 days before the second, altered version of the contract was filed with the county. When confronted by investigators, Pruitt's own assistant, a woman who had worked in his office for over a decade, admitted under questioning that she remembered preparing a second version of a family loan document at Pruitt's direction sometime that spring, though she said at the time she had no reason to question why. Sarah sat through the deposition where Pruitt was questioned directly about the second document. Watching a man who had once shaken her hand warmly at her own wedding now struggle to explain why an altered version of a contract bearing her forged signature had been quietly filed without her knowledge. Pruitt eventually admitted, under pressure from his own attorney to cooperate rather than risk a far more serious charge, that Patricia Whitfield had asked him directly to prepare a version of the loan agreement that would give the family broader grounds to recall it in the future, should Sarah ever, in Patricia's words, become a problem. Pruitt said he had not thought much of the request at the time. He said families like the Whitfields made requests like that more often than most people would assume. Sitting in that deposition room, Sarah finally understood the comment Patricia had made years earlier in her kitchen, the one about stepping back from nursing to focus more fully on the family. It had not been advice at all. It had been the opening move in a plan that had been set in motion within months of the original loan, long before Sarah had ever pushed back about anything. A plan built entirely around the assumption that one day she would. Every small comment, every phone call to her supervisor, every quiet question about her schedule, had been the Whitfields testing how much control they could exert before they needed the forged document at all. The forgery had simply been their insurance, prepared and waiting, in case gratitude alone was not enough to keep Sarah in line. When Carol and Sarah's attorney brought the forensic findings and Pruitt's admission directly to Robert and Patricia Whitfield's legal team, the response was immediate and far less composed than the family that had once sat so calmly across a dinner table from Sarah. Robert's attorney pushed for a private settlement to avoid a public fraud case. Patricia, through her own counsel, denied any knowledge of the altered document despite the banking records showing payment from an account she personally controlled. Michael, caught now in the middle of a forgery investigation involving his own parents, requested a private meeting with Sarah for the first time in over a year, telling her, through tears she had not expected, that he had not known, that he wanted to believe he would never have let it happen if he had. The case against Gerald Pruitt and the Whitfield family moved into formal court proceedings 4 months later, and Sarah sat through nearly every session, watching attorneys lay out, piece by piece, the same story she had lived through in real time. The county prosecutor charged Pruitt with document fraud, citing the falsified notarization and the altered conduct clause, and named Patricia Whitfield as a co-conspirator based on the banking records tying her directly to the payment made before the second filing. Robert Whitfield was not charged criminally, though his own attorney's involvement raised enough questions that the judge ordered a separate civil review of every other contract his office had drafted for the family over the previous decade. Sarah testified on a Tuesday morning in March, describing in plain, unadorned language what the 2 years since her mother's diagnosis had actually cost her: the house, the marriage, months without her son, a reputation she was still working to rebuild at the hospital where she had once felt completely secure. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The judge, reviewing the forensic findings alongside Sarah's own testimony, ruled the second version of the loan contract void in its entirety, restoring the original terms Sarah had actually agreed to and lifting the lien against the house before it could be sold at auction. Pruitt pleaded guilty rather than face trial. Patricia accepted a plea agreement that included a suspended sentence and a substantial fine, an outcome Sarah found difficult to call justice, though her attorney reminded her it was far more than most people in her position ever recovered. With the forged document thrown out, Michael's custody filing collapsed along with it, since the entire request had been built on conduct allegations tied directly to a clause that no longer legally existed. Custody was restored to something close to what it had been before any of this began, and Michael, working through his own complicated grief over his parents, did not contest it. Sarah remembers picking her son up from school the week the ruling came down, watching him run toward her car the way he used to before any of this started, and standing there in the pickup line, crying in a way she had not allowed herself to cry through any of the depositions or court dates that came before it. It was only weeks later, in the quiet that followed, that Sarah learned her mother's cancer had returned. Diane's oncologist explained gently that the original experimental treatment had worked exactly as hoped, but that a critical follow-up screening, scheduled for the same month Sarah had been served with divorce papers and was fighting to keep her house, had been missed entirely during the chaos of that year. By the time a new scan was finally done, the cancer had progressed further than it likely would have if it had been caught on schedule. Sarah sat with that information for a long time before she could bring herself to tell anyone. The quiet, devastating realization that the legal war the Whitfield family had manufactured to control her had cost her mother something that could never be recovered in a courtroom. Sarah moved with her son into a small rented apartment not far from the house she had lost, smaller than anything she had lived in since nursing school, but entirely her own. Diane began a new round of treatment, weaker this time, but still fighting, with Sarah beside her at every appointment the way she had been from the very beginning. One evening, helping her son with his homework at their small kitchen table, Sarah found herself repeating the same words her own mother had told her decades earlier, that they figured things out quietly, that they did not owe anyone anything they could not pay back on their own terms, and she understood, finally, exactly what her mother had been trying to protect her from all along. Sarah Mitchell got her name back. She got her son back. She got more time with her mother than she once feared she would, even if that time came at a cost no court could ever fully repay. She will tell you, if you ask her, that the money itself was never the dangerous part of what happened to her family. It was what people who already had everything were willing to do to someone with nothing, simply to keep control over a woman who had only ever asked for help once in her life and trusted the wrong people to give it to her without a price attached. So we want to ask you directly, would you have signed that contract without reading every single page, the way Sarah did, trusting people simply because they called themselves family? Would you have caught the warning signs months earlier than she did? Or do you think, honestly, you might have made the exact same choice she made, out of love and desperation, the same way most of us would? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one. And if this story kept you holding your breath, wait until you hear what's next.